So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and it's going to be another battle sent to us by Tommy the Wise today, one of the cluster of battles he has sent me recently, and this is going to be a 3v5 between factions rather than a 4v4 such as the last one that we saw. RIP to Damien Payon, by the way, whoever that may be. But yes, this is a map that we have seen before, albeit not for a little while at the very least. And it is a rather interesting one as well. I can't remember off the top of my head what this one is actually called, but it is actually a coastal map with the sea in the distance over there, and then a settlement nestled here in the corner, which often is the focal point for any defensive effort, because it is a reasonably defensible location. 3 choke points in, 2 of which offer a favourable gradient to the defenders. The other one kind of does as well, but if you take full advantage of that you can end up getting cut off for yourself, so that is worth bearing in mind for the defenders as they start to plan their route through this battle. But yeah, we have seen this one. I don't believe we've ever seen the defenders actually victorious on this though. I mean, even though it is a defensible position, a 3v5 is a difficult thing to overcome, so we shall see if the forces on the defence can manage that today. But we'll go through the attackers first of all. There is actually a little settlement over here as well, but that has already been conquered by the forces of Mordor, as we can see here, commanded by add-in men. Temple Guard, a good choice. The general is going to be in there. I mean, you're going to be wanting to use their ammunition first anyway, so you're not going to be committing them into melee early. Though that is one of the main reasons you would bring them. The Temple Guard are a very good substitute for a through-and-through melee unit at the bodyguard tier, but those armour-piercing projectiles as well mean that the defenders are going to have to be very careful, because if they put their very strong units on the front line in an exposed position, the Temple Guard are one of the first things that Mordor will send forward to try and assassinate them. So positioning is going to be key, not only for the Temple Guard themselves, but also for their opponents to try and avoid the damage that they can deliver onto them. Morale infantry are a very by-the-numbers kind of line infantry unit, really. Their main priority really is having a high unit count so that Mordor's numbers can crash down upon the enemy. Individually they're fine, though not spectacular, and that's maybe the best thing you can say about them. Most of the other numerous infantry units in the game, especially when you go into the lower tiers of the evil factions in particular, do tend to sacrifice maybe a little bit too much in terms of quality depending on the situation. But the Morale infantry are perfectly serviceable. Don't expect them to win battles outright on their own, but supported properly in melee and at range, and if you take the right engagements with them, they are a very dependable unit to utilise. Maybe a little bit more exciting from a Mordor perspective are the Blackguard of Barad-dûr. Great Shield infantry are rare in the game, and maybe that's for the best given the cataclysmic effect they can have on an unprepared defence. Mass pushing is maybe a little bit controversial. I mean, I personally think it's probably for the best, because there are situations where you can get involved in a quagmire of a battle and it doesn't go anywhere, effectively. The defenders, especially with the game in its current meta state with rangers, can just bottle people up and shoot them to death. That is fairly rare. Most of the maps are well designed enough to the point where that doesn't come into effect all that often. But this kind of thing for breaking stalemates is kind of necessary in the game's meta, just to make sure that you can't get too comfortable. Though I will admit that the odds are maybe in favour of the mass pushing unit over a defence, but we have seen them fail often enough to the point where if you are defending against this sort of thing, you just need to be prepared for it, and it's as simple as that. So the defenders won't get any sympathy points if they do allow that sort of unit to run roughshod over them. Orc fodder, numbers of course, numbers focused, very very cheap. You can bring many of them to help pad out your numbers as a Mordor army, which is useful, though again, that's really just to make your army look intimidating and be able to sustain an assault under a lot of casualties for a longer period of time. As a spear unit with the Spear Malice, and as a very low tier unit as well, the amount of killing they're going to do, especially against the kind of factions on the defence today, is going to be pretty limited. Orc Javelins, on the other hand, do have some killing potential, in spite of the fact that they are just as, if not even weaker than the Orc fodder in melee, and that's the fact they can throw javelins. We've mentioned several times that the javelins of this tier and cost can be very very useful, simply because the enemy has to respond to them. They either have to shoot them with their own archers, which of course is not really a great value proposition, or try and close them down in melee. They can't really afford to just sit there and take the damage, even though they're not the most devastating javelins in the game. It's still armour-piercing damage, which if you allow them to use all their ammunition on you, can really devastate your front line. So it is a conundrum for enemy forces to have to face. Cavalry is actually the best way to deal with them, interestingly enough, but using cavalry on a map like this is going to be pretty difficult. Moran halberds, the best anchor that the Mordor orcs have really for their line, at least at this tier. They don't have any pikes available to them, but halberds fill the role almost as well. They don't have quite the same range, but they do have armor piercing, which against the right kind of factions is going to be useful. And I would say armor piercing is useful against more factions than it's not useful, if that makes sense. Nazgul are back here as well. They can be used a little bit more freely, seeing as the other Nazgul is in tow with the Temple Guard, and I imagine they'll be committed forward early. At least that's one of the main benefits of the Nazgul. If you embed them even into a unit of Orc fodder, they can be supremely effective. Olag High as well. Trolls, maybe harder to conceal certainly than the Nazgul, but they can be devastating if used at the right time. Moran on infantry, fodder, more Blackguard of Barad-dûr. Going very bodyguard unit heavy here, which is often the temptation with Mordor. Uruk captains do have that armor piercing. Temple executioners are of course a fantastic unit all round. And over here we also have the Moran infantry to round things off. Do they have enough quality in the mid tier, or are they too divided between their bodyguard units and their Moranons? I don't know. But fortunately they do have plenty of allies to lean upon, starting off with Fire Captain Les McBurney, who's playing as Umbar. Certainly they're going to lean a bit more heavily into their quality, you would imagine. Something else they can do is skirmish very effectively with their foe. Belagair archers can do that for a reasonable cost as well. That buckler really does help them when it comes to trading arrows with their opposition, and this is exactly the sort of thing which can be very awkward for defenders to deal with, because using your ranged ammunition wisely is very, very important. Corsair Blackguards are of course far more costly than the Orc Javelins we've already seen, and technically better as well, but there is more of an emphasis on the attackers having to utilise them well. Otherwise, you know, there is a question mark over efficiency and the like. There's a few units of Corsair infantry over here as well, which will help with the skirmishing initially, but they don't have that much ammunition. They simply have a few volleys before they then double as makeshift light infantry. Balakith shield bearers are here without the armour upgrade again. Armour piercing, good shield value there, so even without that armour upgrade they'll be pretty good at mitigating arrow fire. We've got some Balakith Axe Guard for yet more armour piercing. We'll see who's on the defence later, but armour piercing definitely a big focus. The locked morale of the Black Númenóreans as well, the Ardenheim Shield Guard, will help flagging offensive movements last a little bit longer and maybe help reinforcements arrive on time. That is a very useful thing to have. The fact they will fight to the death as well maybe could be the difference between victory and defeat come the end of the battle if it does turn out to be that close, but we shall have to wait and see. More macemen there. Corsair infantry. The Harbingers of Castamere of course are a strong two-handed sword unit, bodyguard tier, very, very powerful. And also back here we have the Naru Na'aru Royal Guard, which is actually where the general is, so the Harbingers can be used a little bit more freely. And the Naru Na'aru Royal Guard, of course, really strong when it comes to skirmishing with the enemy. Huge armour values, locked morale, shields, really, really good. And they can defend themselves from cavalry decently enough as well, considering their spears. Moving on, we have Peugeot playing as the Gondorians, so presumably they've already been conquered by Mordor, and they are moving on to try and help their new Dark Overlord. So Gondor Militia Infantry, obviously as the attackers, when you have 5 armies against 3, you're going to have to cut corners somewhere. The Gondor Militia Infantry will fill a kind of similar role to more entry-level Orcish units. We've already spoken about the Moran Infantry. You can look at the Gondor Militia Infantry in much the same kind of way. But yeah, I mean, they're not going to win any quality battles, but numbers are going to be important here. And if they are backed up by some very high-end units like the Lothlorien Honour Guard, they can behave in a rather Mordor-esque fashion here, Gondor, with a blob of infantry shored up by some very elite units. Skirmishing with the Gondor Militia Archers, they won't be quite as good as the Balagair Archers they're fighting alongside today, but they'll do the same job, essentially. We have the Gondor Archers with an armour upgrade, so they're a little bit more high-end. Wardens of the White Tower, another bodyguard tier unit, so going pretty heavy in for the bodyguard tier units, and that does seem to be a bit of a trend here, the split between the entry-level units for a faction and then the high-tier units for a faction, because other than the militia, pretty much every other kind of unit, with a couple of exceptions, is going to be very expensive, including 2 units of Fountain Guard, a couple of units of Guards of Osgiliath, 2 units of Ravenhelms, 2 bodyguard units. Plagia Marines are fairly mid-tier as a unit goes, more Javelins as well for the defenders to potentially have to deal with as the battle goes along. Moving on, we have the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, played by Evil Casper, so a name I don't recognise, so welcome to the game. Orcs of the Misty Mountains, of course, very numbers heavy, so they're not going to lack for manpower as they try to push forward and take this settlement. Plenty of heavy goblin halberds. We've already spoken about the Moran halberds, and the heavy goblins are very, very similar to their Orcish brethren from the east. and they're going to do very much the same kind of job. One thing that the Misty Mountains do have over Mordor perhaps is an armour-piercing basic spear. The Heavy Goblin spears in many ways do the job of being line infantry better than the Heavy Goblin infantry do. They've got a better shield value so they can withstand more punishment, and the armour-piercing allows them a little bit more bite against the kind of units that you would generally be sending them against. More halberds as well. Probably going to be a few hidden units in between them and what I'd assume to be the more elite units in behind here. Black Uruks of the Mountains, we've seen them be surprisingly effective over the course of this year, and I would be, it's a fairly reasonable assessment that to make that, because obviously the rest of the Misty Mountains army is relatively poor, but the Black Uruks can really punch decently above their weight if you commit them with the right kind of support, I would suggest. White Uruk Fearmongers, Halberdiers, though significantly better than the Heavy Goblins in front of them. Very good core to a Misty Mountains effort here. If you're really trying to turn up the pressure on someone, committing the White Uruks is one way to do it, though they are going to be vulnerable to arrow fire, as any unshielded unit will be. Cave Trolls can do the same kind of job as Great Shield Infantry, though they make it a little bit more difficult for units to follow them, because they tend to go through very quickly, and then the infantry that was there can heal over the lines that they have busted through. They can also find themselves surrounded as a result of that, but they are an interesting tool to use. Heavy Goblin Crossbows, the first example of crossbows we've seen on the attacking force so far today. We've got some Black Uruks as well, and some Goblin King's Bodyguard here at the back, a very dependable unit of sword and board bodyguards. And last but not least, we have Django, who's playing as Harad. Muhard warriors, they will struggle a little bit if the going gets tough in terms of range damage coming down upon them, because of course the Muhards don't really wear armour as such, but their melee abilities are decent for the tier of unit that they are. And the shield does help them a little bit, provided the angle of fire is favourable. They're numerous as well, so that's in their favour. The Haradrim Spearmen are another entry-level unit, most assuredly, so they're just going to be here for numbers more than anything else, because killing power, most certainly not their main focus. Southron Pikemen do have that armour piercing, but again, low stats. Very numerous Harad army this, but I do kind of like it. It does spread out the focuses that we've seen from the attacking armies so far. A few units of archers here and there as well, just to help keep the pressure on for the defenders a little bit more. Got some Beast Tamers in here, which are a seldom seen unit really, because the Southron Pikemen do everything they do, only slightly better because of the armour piercing, and you're not really gaining anything in terms of survivability or stats as such, but it's neat to see them nonetheless. More Beast Tamers. We've got Demons of the Desert, which we saw be very, very effective the last time we saw Harad, albeit that was on the defence. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to use them quite so in such a devastating fashion when they're on the attack, because the defenders will see them coming. 2 units of Trollmen and a unit of Champions of Nafarat is going to be an awful lot of armour piercing. It is going to be heading the defenders' way, very high-end armour piercing as well, and the Serpent's Fangs, which do allow for a high-tier arch unit for Harad, including that poison that they have. Now then, defenders, high-quality defending armies, including Diego Rio Ramos heading up the Dwarves of Khazad. So the armour-piercing elements of the attacking army we have seen will be effective against the Dwarves, but the Dwarves are very, very scary to face when they get dug in. Warriors of Khazad are basic, but basic Dwarven infantry is going to be superior to pretty much every other kind of basic infantry in every measurable way, other than maybe Elven units, and even then I would still argue the Dwarves have the edge there, because the heavy armour and survivability is a little bit better when it comes to line infantry units like this than the more lightfoot approach of the Elves. We've got some Hammers of Gundabad, a locked morale unit, which is going to allow their armies to continue fighting. The armour piercing is also going to be useful against every faction bar Harad in many ways, so that's going to be good for the Dwarves to lean upon as well. Armour upgraded 3rd Legion infantry, so quality of course in terms of line infantry. They're really going to be able to hold the line, the Dwarves, as you would expect. They are, to my mind, Khazad are probably the best line holding faction that the game has to offer. If you throw all of their high-end stuff at it, you have to pay an awful lot to get the absolute most out of them. But it is a very scary force indeed once it gets set. A couple of units of sentry, so basic pikes are going to be important, because you're going to want to at least ask the question of the attackers: can you overcome a solid Dwarven shield wall backed up by Dwarven pikes? And as if that wasn't enough, they also have the 1st Legion pikes over here. I mentioned the armour piercing on the Southron pikemen, but they have to contend with very low stats and being very vulnerable to projectiles as well. That is not the case for the 1st Legion pikes. However, the armour, the slight shield value that they have, makes them more resilient to arrow fire, and they have much better stats. To my mind, this is the best unit of pikes the game has to offer because of that, because overall damage values of pikes is where they generally suffer a little bit. but you could argue that the second hit point of the Khazad's Guardians of Lothlorien makes them superior. A couple of units of Sons of the Fallen, one of the best units of spears that the game has to offer. All 3 bodyguard units, not too surprising when you're on the defence like this, with the Legion bodyguard being more of a run-of-the-mill, in quotation marks, bodyguard unit. But then you have the 3 hit points of the Mithril Guard and the armour piercing of the Guards of Khazad. All 3 of these units, though, fantastic, and there's very few units on the attacking army that would want to face them. Orc Hunters allow them that ranged presence. Of course, Khazad, when it comes to their range damage, at least long-range damage, the Orc Hunters are really the only option they have, and they're serviceable, but there are other factions which will do this job better. But when it comes to close-range punch, these 2 units, the Khazad Reclaimers with their throwing axes for really busting through those dangerous, especially shieldless units that the attackers will be sending forward. And then there's the Iron Watch, which really, in terms of the devastation they can cause, are every bit as menacing as the Witchers, really. They don't do it quite so quickly, but there's not really much you can do to stop them. There are more of them, they're more heavily armoured, so they're going to be more difficult to kill off than the Witchers. Balin is there, so they're also going to be saved till later, you would have to suggest. Moving on, we have Crdolan, played by Bard the Bowman, so the west hasn't fallen even if Gondor in the south and east have. So, Dunedain captains, Crdolan, when they have a lot of money to play with, you can imagine the kind of units they're going to bring, and armour upgraded Dunedain captains, it's very unsurprising to see them in their maximum numbers. Warns of Tir Gorthad, and even though they are cheap, the Greenway Garrison footmen are going to be another important facet of this army. I think pikes are one of the things the defenders will have to rely upon when they dig into the settlement in the corner. Tharbad Warhammers, as we mentioned with the dwarves, armour piercing is going to be useful against the attackers here, so the Tharbad Warhammers are a good choice. Some Minhiriath units scattered throughout the army as well, just to help pad out the numbers. Interesting to see Greenway Garrison archers. They can more freely skirmish with the annoying archers that the attackers have brought, I suppose. Maybe that is the feeling. As can the Minhiriath archers. So Crdolan may be being used here as a bit of a workhorse army for the dwarves and elves fighting alongside them to really showcase their abilities. Of course, they do have crossbows, which neither Khazad nor Imladris have in their stable, so that's going to be useful. Hearthguard and Minotaur Romain gatekeepers as well, so they're bringing an awful lot of ranged power as much as they can. I'd be very surprised not to see the Rangers pop into existence as well. And a trebuchet. We've seen artillery be incredibly effective of late, and the trebuchet on a map like this, provided they position themselves correctly, can be as well. No artillery for the attackers, so it cannot be sniped out either, unless they get axe throwers close enough, but I don't think there are any axe throwers either. And it wasn't Imladris, I'm just talking nonsense. It is in fact Lothlorien, so Tommy the Wise playing as the elves, but they offer many of the same kind of strengths. Not quite as solid in melee, but better at range, you would have to say, so maybe that is going to be a good thing in this situation. Lorenan Swordmasters, they will of course carve their way through, especially the rank and file units that are going to be coming at them. Armour piercing, already said, it's going to be very useful. The Lorenan Warriors offer Lothlorien something the other elven factions don't in a dedicated shock infantry unit that is armour piercing, which is not a bodyguard tier unit, you can only have one of. Lorenan Spearmen will be very useful for helping the line as well. That elven melee defence is already very strong. Combine that with the defensive nature of spears, you're on to a winner. We have the Lorenan Axemen as well, very damaging of course. It's the sort of thing which Lothlorien are very good at. They're a little bit more savage perhaps when it comes to dealing that damage than their cousins over in Imladris. They do lack a little bit maybe of the refinement of them, but maybe doing that damage is going to be the important thing here. Some more defensive javelins in the Woodland Protectors. Already mentioned these guys briefly when talking about the 1st Legion, and while I do prefer the 1st Legion, there's no doubt in the Khazad's Guardians are also a really, really strong unit. Pikes, that second hit point makes them a real problem, especially if they're still alive in the late game and the attackers have got no ranged units to try and whittle them down with. More poison projectiles being offered by the March Wardens of the Wood. Lorenan archers, heavy elven archers, not only very strong at range but also can double up as heavy swordsmen in melee. And the very best Lothlorien units really are the archers, multiple HP archers that have special projectiles, which can also be very effective in melee. One unit of Watchers of the Golden Wood with their Silver Thorns will make life a little bit more difficult to advance through them. 2 units of Kindred of Celeborn upgraded as well. Dual wielders, the split shots are probably more damaging at range, but I would argue that the Watchers are stronger in melee, so if it was an option I would have gone for 2 units of Watchers. But, you know, much of a muchness really, they're still going to both be very effective. And last but not least, of course, we have Haldir, who's actually with the Karen Amroth Rangers, which takes away their ability to hide, so I'm not sure of the wisdom of this move, but as long, really, if you're allowing your Rangers to get shot at anyway, you're probably doing it wrong in the first place. So, yeah, Karen Amroth Rangers. Elven Rangers with that extra point of damage can be very, very scary as well, and they may have to lean on them a little bit more heavily as well. Khazad, of course, don't have rangers. We didn't see the Dunedain rangers, though I'd be surprised to see them missing. But yeah, we're going to make a little bit of a cut here, because I do imagine there's going to be a bit of a grace period allowing Crdolan into the defensive fold, and Khazad as well. So yeah, I'll make a cut, and we'll rejoin when the battle is about to get underway. So I think we will rejoin here, because we may actually see these heavy goblin spears start to brush up against the elven front line. Indeed we will. The first combat has taken place. Whether or not this was intentional by Evil Casper or not, I'm not sure, or whether he was simply trying to set up his front line, but you can see that the grace period has been observed, and we are going to be seeing the elves take the lead on this front line, and Crdolan take the lead over here, and Khazad towards the rear edge of the settlement. And there is a little bit of mixing and matching, but for the most part the defenders are going to be focusing on their individual areas. You can see a little bit further back there as well. Seems like the vast majority of the Gondorians are actually going to be helping Mordor try to smash through the Crdolan front line, perhaps identifying Crdolan as more of a weak link in comparison to the kind of infantry that the other two factions can bring to bear. So, I mean, that's fair enough, I suppose. You can see over here that it is going to be Harad under the command of Django. So the armour piercing will definitely find itself very much at home against the dwarves, but again, Harad, do they have the solidity to be able to mix it with Khazad in that kind of warfare over a longer period of time? We'll have to wait and see. I mean, the crossfire that Lothlorien have set up here is going to be pretty nasty for anyone that's coming this way. The kind of damage that Lothlorien can chuck out is going to be significant. The poison projectiles are also going to be very useful for breaking off goblin regiments, which is going to make up a decent portion of the attacking force over here. It's worth bearing that in mind as well. Although I believe perhaps the grace period is still being observed, which is a little bit unfortunate. I mean, there comes a point where people go a little bit too heavy on these, to be honest. Like, eventually, just let it go. Like, there's no need to be so creeping and slow when everyone else is already in position. And I'm not really seeing the reason for holding off, to be honest. I mean, the Gondorians are still slowly marching their way into position, but it's not as if you can get all of these units through this narrow gap as quickly as you may like anyway. Maybe they're waiting for Harad. But even they are kind of ready to roll. Cross the bridge, and then they're in the jaws of the dwarven infantry, really. There's no other way for them to go. I mean, this is definitely the least appealing of the routes to take into the settlement, you'd have to say, for Harad. The dwarves can clog it up with high-end infantry easily enough, and they don't have maybe the best ranged presence on the field in comparison to their allies, outside of their one specialty projectile unit and their axe throwers. Their archers are fine, though, and even basic archers are going to be good against the Haradrim. Now then, what have we got here? We do actually have damage being done. Lorinarn warriors, Karas Galadon's guardians are on the front line right away from Tommy the Wise as well, and Lorinarn spears. So this is really a statement of intent. It means that Lothlorien are going to be willing to hold on to this, and they're going to commit strong units in order to be able to do so, which means the attackers are also going to have to commit strong units, otherwise they're not really going to be able to achieve anything. But in doing that, of course, they will represent a very big target for the Lothlorien archers that are either side. So I do like the setup here so far. Lorinarn warriors says defeats is a distinct possibility, but I don't think that's really accurate. The goblin infantry are almost certainly going to rout before they make any real inroads here. I mean, the heavy goblin spears moving forward. The armour piercing won't go completely to waste against Lothlorien, but the kind of melee defence that Lothlorien have at their disposal is going to really help their cause here. And the Lothlorien projectiles, I mean, Lorinarn archers starting to open up on the hillside as well. Corsair infantry moving forward to offer a little bit of support, but you can see the poison arrows already shooting at them. Black Uruks are a good target as well, because they will actually be fairly decent at fighting against Lothlorien. 1-to-1 they'll still lose against a lot of these Lorinarn units, but they will at least be a better match for them than the goblins and heavy goblins that comprise the front line as it stands. Over here, meanwhile, kind of a similar story. The Kindred of Celeborn starting to fire away. You can see some attacking archers in position as well. The Gondor militia archers trying to do their thing. And against the basic Crdolan ones, they will trade relatively evenly. Once again, over here we're seeing a pike-driven front line, though with the Crdolan pikes it's obviously significantly less powerful than the Karos Galadon's Guardians in the central choke. But here, Gondor actually taking the lead, which is kind of interesting. And kind of surprising, actually. Lothlorien Honor Guard are right in the centre of this as well, so they are wanting to put the screws to Crdolan at least a little bit, sending forward this high-tier infantry unit. But Crdolan have their own high-end unit in there as well, in the shape of the Dunedain Captains. Bandits moving forward as well to offer a little bit of support. Javelins, exactly the sort of thing which are going to be universally useful, really, against the Gondorians. There are some Orc fodder in there as well, but that's the sum total of Mordor's contribution to this front line so far. Though that will change as the battle goes along. Some Dwarven units as well, so they are, with an Elven Archer unit, some Dwarven infantry here and there, they are willing to help support their human companions here, as the West makes its stand. Over here, meanwhile, Harad are slowly moving forward. It's perhaps a little bit more understandable that they are taking their time with it. If they're on their own and they don't have any... I think based on how far back that... Yeah, there's a few Misty Mountains units there as well, so they should have the manpower to mount a sustained assault. Whether it'll be successful or not, I'm not so sure. All kinds of Khazad firing away, and it is actually the Serpent's Fangs returning fire. But again, the terrain is such that the Dwarves will fancy their chances in that particular matchup. Well, back in the middle, the assault continues. Corsair infantry being committed to melee. Once again, not exactly the sort of thing which is going to be terribly powerful, and there you can see a devastating hit from the Iron Watch, who are... yeah, there they are. Iron Watch of Miramir. Every bit as dangerous as the Witches, and in fact with their Arc of Fire in this kind of situation, they're probably even more dangerous than the Witches, because you can't return fire, you can't really do anything about them being there. Because there's only 3 ways into the settlement, you're going to have to accept the fact that some of your units are going to get flattened by their mortar projectiles. And that is exactly what happened there. Flaming projectiles as well. Iron Watch cause a lot of damage to morale, and trying to double down on that with the flaming shot is going to be the sort of thing which I don't really think the Misty Mountains are going to be able to withstand a great deal of. It is a conundrum this though for the armies in the middle. I do think that because they know the Iron Watch is here, Harad need to start attacking Khazad from the back, and Gondor and Mordor perhaps need to turn up the pressure on Crdolan, because if they're reliant on trying to go through this central position, the Lothlorien line is going to hold steadfastly with those pikes and with those high-end units. There's also some Dwarven pikes in there as well to double down on that. The Misty Mountains and Umbar are not going to be able to make their way through here. The most they can really do is sustain the assault and hope that their allies can do their thing. Harbingers of Castamere also getting absolutely rinsed by projectiles. Those Woodland Protectors. Yeah, it's been a really tough battle so far for the Misty Mountains and Umbar. And if they continue to lose units at a rate of knots like this, it's probably a good thing for the defenders. Are we seeing the beginnings of the assault over here? Not really. The Haradrim Spearmen are moving up. Muhard Warriors. Still some projectiles coming in from Harad. Orc Hunters getting chased by the Haradrim Spearmen, and actually they will get caught, but I mean the Haradrim Spearmen will actually lose in melee to the Orc Hunters of Khazad. They're going to need some more infantry units if they are to make an impression here, Harad. We're hoping that their armour piercing can impress itself upon these dwarven infantrymen. Our warriors also a little bit further back. What do we have here? Around on infantry, having a look. I mean, it does look... Greenway Garrison Archers moving forwards, breaking the line, trying to plug the gap. They're obviously very poor in melee, but they will at least stand in the way. Bandits in behind taking a lot of damage. It's been a little bit tit for tat over here. You can see the fact that clearly Crdolan have taken a fair amount of damage here, but also I can't help but feel as though this assault is on the verge of collapse from Gondor and Mordor as well. I think they need to send forward more than just militia archers. Being a little bit stingy there. Morale on infantry are at least dedicated infantry units, so they will do slightly better. Lothlorien Honor Guard broken and fighting to the death. That's a sign that you haven't supported this assault maybe as readily as you should. There's a lot of units still really far back as well. Need to be a little bit more willing to commit units forward, because they were actually doing damage to the Crdolan front line there, and there may have been an opportunity for them to turn the screw, but I think maybe that opportunity has passed. Crdolan, of course, do have those crossbows. That is worth bearing in mind as well, like, Crdolan will be able to do a lot of damage to units that are committed forwards, but that's the nature of the beast when you're in a 5v3. You have to be willing to take a lot of damage as the attackers, and if you are, very often, that's good enough for you to claim the momentum and start pushing the enemy line back. Speaking of pushing, Blackguard and Barad-dûr on their way forward, they can pretty easily bulldoze their way through what's left of the Crdolan front line here, especially in conjunction with some fresh Morannon units to help bolster the numbers. Olag High as well. This is a little bit more like it from Mordor. This will force Crdolan's hand, most certainly. Morannon infantry are routing, but routing towards the enemy. Some Hams of Gondor coming over here. So the Dwarves of Khazad definitely willing to assist their middlemen friends. Morannon infantry are here. Still the dizzying array of projectiles that Crdolan have at their disposal doing their thing. Some Minhiriath archers out of ammunition and committed to melee to try and hold back the Olag High, though how successful they're going to be in that endeavour, I question it. Armour-piercing projectiles as well, so that'll be the Wardens of Minas Ithil. Actually, no, Temple Guard, of course. I mean, this is decent, this from Mordor. They're now into the back lines with their trolls, going to be able to roll through the Crdolan archers and crossbows. Silence them a little bit. And of course the trebuchets at the top of that hill. There's no retreat from the top of that hill either, so they may as well just start dumping their ammunition now, otherwise it's going to be utterly useless. Out of ammunition, Gondor archers move forward with the Raven Helms to try and bolster this Mordor assault. Going back to the middle over here, we can see that, yeah, the momentum well and truly in the defenders' favour, whereas it's slowly ticking over to the attackers where we just were. This assault has pretty much completely collapsed. Goblin infantry is still there. The elves and dwarves that were manning this front line lurching forward to try and finish off what remained of this attack. Lorand Axemen still doing their thing. Still a couple of Harbingers of Castamere, but they won't last too much longer. But yeah, the positioning of the projectiles, in particular the Iron Watch, proving to be too much there. They are willing to come forward for another go though. And immediately, as soon as the Balakath Axe Guard come into view, they become the next target for the Elven Archer line. At least they will have a harder time breaking the Umbar units. Corsair Blackguards moving forwards as well. Snaga Skirmishers broken and fighting to the death. Do need to reorganise their front line, fairly sharpish here, Lothlorien and Khazad. We'll see. Champions of Nafarat crossing the bridges. And at the top of the hill here, I mean, angles-wise actually, it's fairly even terrain they've managed to force the dwarves into an engagement with here. Southron Pikemen and Muhard warriors facing off against warriors of Khazad and sentries of Khazad. The armour piercing of the Southron Pikes would have come into its own here if not for the fact that the archers are right there and the Khazad reclaimers are right there doing a ton of damage. And the low armour nature of Harad means axe throwers are especially effective against them. Yeah, that dwarven front line, even the basic dwarven units make for a very, very solid front line indeed. As the throwing axes continue to flow, and the Orc Hunters continue as well to fire both into the infantry and into the archers across the river. Our Beast Tamers now leaving. I mean, it's never a good sign when you see the attackers actively quitting the front line, as opposed to having their units routed. They don't really have a choice here. Like they're going to need to consolidate their forces, come forward with a bit more strength. If they've got javelins of their own, put them in a position where they can return fire into the Khazad reclaimers rather than just banging their head against the wall is Khazad's front line here. Over yonder, meanwhile, this is where the attackers have had the most joy, but they need to be willing to commit forward reinforcements on a consistent basis. Orc fodder guards of Osgiliath struggling a little bit. They need to get their formation into play, otherwise the Hearthguard backed up by the Minhiriath sharpshooters wielding those maces could prove to be a real problem. The armor piercing projectiles still coming in, and that's one of the main differences here Mordor and Gondor have been able to really bring to bear their own projectiles. You can't really do that in the middle quite so easily where the Misty Mountains and Umbar are, but Harad, like I said, can probably get a little bit closer with theirs before being exploited in a fashion. What was that? Is that the trebuchet? No, it's not. It's the Iron Watch, I believe. Where are they? There they are. Perhaps seeing the fact that momentum was shifting in favour of the attackers here, they've moved over the Iron Watch to try and hold them at bay. I don't like the screen shake of the Iron Watch, it's really obnoxious. It's kind of similar to the screen shake that the Watcher inflicts as well. All javelins moving forward. The Legion bodyguard here as well. So I mean, Khazad, the fact that they've been willing to commit so many units over here and, you know, help their allies is again a green light for Harad and that wing of the Misty Mountains army to start attacking along the southernmost point of the map with a little bit more venom than they've currently done. Even though the dwarves can make do with less units to guard a choke point because of their quality and survivability, over the long haul, especially against factions like Harad who have the damage to be able to worry them, it's definitely the sort of thing they should be looking to do a little bit more of, I think. Guards of Khazad, the balance of forces evenly matched. Again, that's another bodyguard tier unit. And they have their Iron Watch over here, so all of the best units of Khazad really are over here trying to stop the progress of Gondor and Mordor. And those are clear projectiles from Rangers. Carrying Amroth Rangers as well, so Lothlorien as well are actually dipping in over here. So really, through no fault of their own, Gondor and Mordor may end up getting defeated here. This, however, is a little bit more like it. They didn't manage to get their front line perhaps into shape quite quickly enough. The snow trolls causing a little bit of pandemonium. They will be dealt with fairly sharpish by heavy elven swordsmen, but what's going on here? Lorien warriors holding back a column of heavy goblin halberds as they get shot, so still the problem here truly for the attackers is the projectiles, and surely the heavy goblin halberds are not going to last too much longer under that kind of attention. Archwardens of the Wood. One-armed axemen. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle, but that will probably change. The Karas Galadon's Guardians are still alive. Not tons and tons of them, but they're definitely a unit for the long haul when you use them in this kind of situation. Snaga Skirmish is going to try and use some more basic javelins to help crack through this line. I mean, for a little while there, the Snow Trolls can still make a nuisance of themselves because of how quick they are, but for a little while it looked like maybe Umbar and the Misty Mountains were going to start turning the defenders back. But now that the front line has once again been reformed, for the most part, I think they'll struggle given the damage they've already taken. But the Iron Watch are no longer here either, so they can't use that panic button, at least not immediately. They would have to move them back. Demons of the Desert, ready to move forward. That's exactly the kind of unit which can definitely turn a battle on its head, as we've seen recently. And the Dwarves, let's not forget the fact that they have committed units elsewhere. Trollmen are now here, plenty of polearms, the Champions of Nafrat are right in here, all of the tribal units of Harad pushing forwards, and I don't think the Dwarves actually have enough over here to really be able to hold them at bay forever. I mean, the First Legion pikes are very, very strong, though the main selling point for them is, of course, that armour piercing. Less useful against Harad. Just sending forward more units. The Sons of the Fallen are a fantastic line-holding unit, but all they can really do, I think, is delay Harad's progress. Unless more reinforcements are forthcoming, pikes are going to move in. I mean, the pikes will make life more difficult in the way the pikes always do. They just won't quite be the destroyers of worlds that they often can be. Look at that guy. He is perched up there. So they will hold, but this is where the Trollmen and the Champions of Nafrat and Harad's better units really should shine, and the Dwarves should be quite concerned here, I think, as the First Legion pikes march their way into position. What's going on here? What are they doing? No, 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 no. Why? Why, why, why? Oh, it's a disaster. It's a disaster. Are they going to try and use the Demons of the Desert? Is that the ploy? They've moved forwards. If this works, then fair enough, but to peel yourself off the front line when you're slowly gaining the upper hand, I think is a mistake. But the Demons of the Desert, will they fire in time? Will the dwarves even realise what's going on? I mean, they should. It was very clear, really. Yeah, it's not going to work. I suppose it was worth a go, but it's not going to work out for them, I don't think. Well, killed off a big chunk of those Sons of the Fallen there. I don't know. I don't know if that was. I guess they're trying to go after the First Legion pikes, right? I guess that's the play there, but I don't know. It's definitely a weird one. I think I'm kind of neutral actually on that. The more I think about it. Over here, meanwhile, it does look as though eventually the defenders are going to be outright victorious. That, I believe, is the Mordor general, actually. They don't have anything left over here. They have committed everything. They did claim the momentum as well, but thanks to the support they got from Elven and Dwarven units, Crdolan, under the command of Bard the Bowman, have been able to do the business here. Crdolan don't have all that much left. They do have a trebuchet. They've got a few units here and there which can be committed to help their allies as well. The gatekeepers in melee are not too bad, but they're a little bit depleted at this stage. That'll be either the Gondorian or Mordor general. So both generals now have fallen. Almost perfectly in conjunction with their ultimate defeat in this battle. Yeah. More combat occurring down here. Warns of the White Tower, pretty much the only thing that remains. Hammers of Gundabad perfectly positioned to deal with them. And elsewhere, so yeah, Crdolan will be able to push everything else that they have over to help their allies, which is always a good thing for the defenders. It means that they can focus on certain areas, but it's not a huge amount of strength they still have left to them. So the Misty Mountains and Umbar, in spite of the huge amount of punishment they took earlier on, have managed to outlast Gondor and Mordor, but focuses were shifting. I do believe if the attacks are to be successful in this battle, it will have to be on the back end of the settlement, and Harad and what the Misty Mountains have over there are going to have to start making progress pretty quickly, because if the defenders can consolidate all their strength into trying to stop Harad back there, then obviously it will be a defender's victory. Corsair infantry still firing away. They are getting engaged slowly though in melee by more of these Lothlorien units, and needless to say, Lorenan Swordmasters will rip their way through Corsair infantry with little fuss. Point blank arrow fire. What do they still have left over here then? So some crossbows. This is probably the kind of unit which has been silently effective in this battle, to be fair, as the battle has become a little bit more competitive over here, as the Misty Mountains and Umbar have at least impressed themselves slightly on this battle. Crossbows can go a little way to helping with that as well. Corsair Blackguard's a little bit depleted. Corsair Crossmen, of course, more fragile than their Goblin counterparts, but very much the same sort of thing. Belagair Archers, yeah, I mean, looking at the rest of it, Naranari Royal Guard, Whiteruk Fearmongers, they've got some units which are capable in melee, but not nearly enough of them at this point to be victorious in any capacity. A lot of projectiles still coming forth though. Belagair Archers and crossbows trying to do as much damage as they reasonably can. Whiteruks backing up their Corsair counterparts. The elves are trying to reorganise themselves there. Khazad reclaimers. So here on the backside of the settlement, what is going on here? Harad is still in place. Demons of the Desert trying to do their thing, and I'm actually surprised that Diego Rio Ramos chased Harad down here, because It does look as though they have allowed the Demons of the Desert to be used a little bit more effectively than they otherwise would, but the time has come for Harad to be far more aggressive. The time may have already come and gone, actually, based on the attacker's fate on the front side of the settlement. But we'll see. Still have a decent amount of strength to them. The Blackback Berserkers are over here as well, which I think actually are the only Misty Mountains unit that are over here. No, Heavy Goblin Halberds as well. So a few units left. Stuff like the Trollmen will be a worry. As we move through this battle, still a decent amount of this battle left though, which is fairly interesting, given how much violence we've already seen. White Orc Fearmonger slowly trudging their way forwards. Lothlorien Spearmen, there's only 4 of them, and yet they've managed to hold the line for far longer than they had any right to. Interesting matchup here between the White Orcs and the Khazad Reclaimers. The Misty Mountains versus Khazad, one of the classic matchups as well. Of course, our infantry making their way forwards as well. I think maybe this unit of Khazad Reclaimers were just forgotten about, otherwise they too would have been saved for a more combined effort front line. The Goblin King's bodyguard, only 6 of them remain, but it does include the general, having to commit forward one of their more important units, but he has managed to fight on. Now our Royal Guard also in and amongst things now, so the Misty Mountains and Umbar generals going to have to put themselves in harm's way really. The Mithril Guard are here as well. They don't want to get caught out really. Lothlorien still reasonably healthy. Still got some very dangerous units. Crdolan, of course, not so healthy. Still with some units here and there. Going to reorganise themselves first. I mean, to be fair, I don't know if, even with all their units and even with them out of position, I don't know if they could beat the Mithril Guard, at least not in a way that they would find acceptable. They may have to try and shoot them first. Of course, their Blackguard's going to do the business. Well, they're not going to get a choice in the matter. The Mithril Guard are going to charge in. He wasn't going to lose micro on them forever, after all. And now the 3 hit point juggernauts are going to stand in the way of any further progress here. So technically, Lothlorien and, well, the Misty Mountains and Umbar are going to be able to push their way further into the settlements. Naga skirmishers, so they still have ammunition. Javelins are one of the only ways in which they're going to be able to make an impression on the Mithril Guard. They're actually committing their General's bodyguard unit in, which is bold. The General stands a very significant chance of perishing when fighting the Mithril Guard. White Orc Fearmongers will do a better job though. Halberds, they're gonna retreat, and rightly so. The danger that those javelins pose isn't something that you should just allow the attackers to do. They have actually retreated completely from this position, which I find pretty interesting. So Harad have pushed their way through. I mean, is there a better place to make a stand than there? You can actually see that going through the well, I don't know. What is going on? So the fences are such that you can't really go around here, but there is a gap, and that's exactly what the Kindred are taking advantage of here. Going through this area and then around. We haven't actually seen this part of the settlement used as such in the past. This is, for all intents and purposes, as far back as you can retreat on the map. Though you have to defend from 2 directions, and I'm not convinced that maybe simply staying on that choke point because it's so favourable wouldn't have been the right thing to do, but we'll see. Based on that, I may actually be even willing to give the attackers the edge moving into the final stages of this battle, even in spite of the punishment they've taken up to now. It is mostly Lothlorien that remain, with a smattering of Crdolan and Khazad to help out. Khazad Reclaimers, Wardens of Tir and Gorthad, Mithril Guard still moving as well. Still some projectiles as well. Of course, our Blackguards poking away at them as they retreat, and Mithril Guard falling. Every one Mithril Guard that is felled is fairly significant after all. Archers. Not a huge amount of strength left in this army, to be honest. The Iron Royal Guard and the White Uruks are the two that would stand out there. The rest just going to be making up the numbers, and I suppose the Blackbacks are making their way over here now. They may have initially been sent over there with the expectation they would be needed to help the push of Harad, but in the end it never quite came to that. Hard Beast Hunters killing off that small amount of March Ones of the Wood. So this will be the final stage of the battle, and we will have maybe a little over 10,000 frames of this final stand. It may be because they're sneakily using the maze-like structure of the back of this settlement here. You can see that they have managed to effectively stow away some Kindred of Calaborn back here with some Lorinard archers. It will be interesting to see if the attackers know that this is the way that they get through there. That one gap in the fence there and go through the graveyard. Now an Iron Royal Guard taking hits, and they will actually also take a charge from the Khazad Reclaimers. Those two-handed axes and melee, exactly what's needed to get through that Black Numenorian plate. Further back over here there is actually some Hammers of Gundabad. Locked morale, so they will maintain themselves as a thorn in the side of the attackers out here, trying to kill off as many of those archers as they can, though the Blackback Berserkers will sort them out. No, an Iron Royal Guard defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. Moving forward now, the Mithril Guard as well. White Uruks, in spite of the combat they've seen, maintain themselves as one of the more dangerous foes. Still with a bit of crossbow ammunition as well, so in spite of the damage the defenders have been able to do so far, it is still very, very close moving into the final stages here. Do the attackers have the resources necessary to do the business? Mithril Guard moving out here as well alongside the Khazad Reclaimers. Right onto the front of the White Uruks though, probably one of the few units that will at least do a little bit of damage through that legendary armour of theirs. Hammers continuing to make a nuisance of themselves. Back over here meanwhile, Harad, it is another very narrow choke point Harad having to deal with. Crdolan committing forward their gatekeepers alongside the Watchers of the Golden Wood. A little bit of support coming in from the Elven Archers in behind as well, which Harad won't enjoy too much. Going after the Javelin Regiments, Beast Hunters, and of course still the Demons. Haradrim Spearmen. It's not a limitless supply of units that Harad have left, but they do have Trollmen, they do have Champions of Nafarat. They have enough to be of real concern in conjunction with the Misty Mountains and Umbar on the other side. It's actually the Minhiriath Archers that are in support rather than Elven ones, so maybe not too damaging, but any support is going to be welcomed here. Ready to fire potentially as well. I mean, the fact that Wardens of Tir and Gorthad are still in good condition as well is pretty important, I think. The ability to have a pike-led defence at this late stage, late game pikes, always a real boon for whoever still has them alive. Snarga Skirmishers continuing to throw javelins. May not be the most effective javelins in the world, but trying to whittle down the Mithril Guard here. The Dwarves being aggressive. I mean, Khazad Reclaimers. This honestly may be the situation in which Balagai Archers, I think, have found their way around the back of this settlement over here. But this is kind of the situation where those Kindred should probably be launching a joint counter-attack with the Dwarves, because honestly, the Blackbacks being here, the Javelin support being here, without the Kindred of Calaborn and those Lorinard Archers lending a hand, I think the Dwarves lose this engagement against the Misty Mountains, and that could well prove to be catastrophic moving into the game's final stages. But we'll see. There goes Azog. The Iron Watcher and melee here as well. I mean, in melee they really are more just here to be a 2 hit point brick of armour. Their melee stats are obviously not quite as high as many of the other Dwarven Bodyguard units. Similar story with the Blacklock Engineers of Erebor. That 2nd hit point is nice, but it's not the be-all and end-all when it comes to making and breaking a bodyguard unit. Snarker Skirmishers still doing their thing, Corsair Blackguards. Here we go. As if Tommy heard me, he is now counter-attacking with his Elven units. And with Kindred of Celeborn coming forth in these kinds of numbers, not enough to save Balin, as he lies slain at the hands of those javelins. But with the Kindred of Celeborn moving forward, they should have enough, you would think, although they have arrived a little late, you have to say. The Meteor Guard succumbing to the pressure of the javelins and being in melee with one of the very few units that they would worry about the damage they can chuck out, the Blackbacks. And indeed they retreat as a result of that as well. They go back to hiding. Though surely they know they're there at this point, and I mean, leaving this whole street completely clear, is that going to be the answer? You can end up with the bulk of your units being surrounded, so it's a risk that Tommy's taking here. It may end up paying off because they will have some late game Kindred that can be used to counter-attack or potentially just siphon off some of the strength the attackers still have left, but I don't know. Very, very risky as Harad moving forward with their Trollmen, putting the Watchers of the Goldenwood under a lot of pressure. Karen Emerald Rangers out of ammunition. They're decent enough in melee, but they're going to need more. They're going to need the Warns of Tir Gorthad. Like, the defenders are playing with fire a little bit, I feel like, here. There's a few instances of where, if it does turn out they're making the wrong call, not having the pikes in, not committing the Kindred early enough, these are the sort of decisions which can result in an unfortunate loss, given the fact that for the most part I think the defenders have done probably a little bit better throughout this battle. There goes the Elven General. Lothlorien very unlikely to rout anyway, so not too much of a problem there. Snarker Skirmishers running after the Minhiriath archers shot them. One of the Kindred of Celeborn got left behind and ultimately surrounded and killed by Corsair infantry. Now they move forward once again. I mean, with more than one of them at the very least, these Corsairs stand a pretty high chance of being routed off. Goblin crossbows are routing, Blackback Berserkers turning around. So some units are going to put some pressure on from the other side. It's only going to be Balagair archers, but it's better than nothing. And I think the Blackbacks are moving in here to try and smoke out the Kindred of Celeborn that are hidden in and amongst the buildings here. Zach Foster. Only 2 names allowed in this town by the looks of things. Also Blackguards. I mean, I don't really approve of the battle taking place over here because it obviously looks kind of goofy when you're moving through buildings that don't actually have a solid model that you can clip through. It's kind of cinematic, I suppose, to fight in the graveyard, but I don't know. And Archer's going to get into those Corsair crossbows over there, which that will deal with them very, very quickly. So Lothlorien going to do the business over here. Balagair archers pull backwards a little bit. The Warns of Tir Gorthad now have been committed to the front line. Better late than never, but the Heavy Goblin Halberds moving in to try and also help shore up the attackers over on this side. Just in behind, Trebuchet. And Hiriath archers also loitering with intent. I don't know, if you look there, Balagire archers routing, wavering. Without the blackbacks and the like, they didn't really have the strength to maintain an assault from that side. I think it's ultimately going to come down to the attackers being defeated everywhere other than here, and Harad having to try and slog it out in a very narrow choke point, but I don't think that's going to end too well either. Blackback Berserkers leaving once again. What is going on here? What is with this cat and mouse? What have we here? Harad also taking advantage of the fact that you can go around the houses. It's not going to help them too much because the Kindred and the Lorien archers will butcher their way through these Muhad warriors, but I like the fact that Harad identified the fact that you can go around, so I guess you can go this way as well, somehow. Have to go right back over here, I guess? Yeah, so there is a gap. And Harad also doing that, so that's something. Maybe not an intentional part of the map, this, but it has added a little bit of spice to the late game. Victory almost a certainty for the Muhad warriors, actually, so really trying to give it their all in melee. And with the odd javelin coming in from the Corsair Blackguards as well, could this turn out to be an attacker victory after all? Having a look over here, Minhiriath archers, Trebuchet crew, Blackback Berserkers now putting pressure on over here as well, so the Kindred of Celeborn kind of marooned at the back of the map now and having to deal with basic Harad units while the Misty Mountains commit their strongest unit left to try and surround the final stand here. Balagire archers also putting on some pressure from afar, going back and forth with the Minhiriath archers, although the Balagire are trying to hit into the back of this formation over here, which is exactly the right thing to do, because if you can get rid of those Wardens of Tir Gorthad, Harad will swamp over, and by the looks of things, the attackers are going to be victorious here. The last series of moves definitely in their favour. Well, well, well. Still see the fighting going on back there. 31 Kindred of Celeborn, although this is only a small portion of their unit. They are preventing the Southron archers from firing at the very least, but I think even as just fodder and melee, the Southron archers are doing their job here. Muhad warriors are being brought down now. Kindred of Celeborn showcasing their skill in melee, but this has been a diversion which Lothlorien could scarcely afford. They were the ones who decided to come back into this corner. So if it does turn out that the rest of their army is overwhelmed before they can get there, they've got no one but themselves to blame. Snaga Skirmish is moving forward. There's 8 Kindred of Celeborn coming over here now, but that's not going to be enough to make a huge difference. The Trebuchet crew, there's nowhere for them to run, so I don't know why they tried. They just need to try and hold up the Blackback Berserkers for as long as possible, get as many arrows into them as they can. Wardens of Tir Gorthad just need to hold on for as long as they can as well. Even then, I don't think it's going to be enough. I mean, there's 39 Trollmen of Harad there. That's enough to cancel out any reinforcements the Kindred of Celeborn could provide. Victory seems certain, only a fool could lose this battle. Very one-sided when you have an artillery crew facing off against a bodyguard tier unit. But they have to do their bit, they have to stand in the way. Balagire archers still have ammunition as well, although they are at least being interrupted now by the Kindred. Lorien archers on their way down here as well. Should be enough to mop up the Balagire archers, though like I said, I don't think that's going to be enough to actually impact the outcome of this battle on the whole. Try to get into position again, but yeah, Minhiriath archers, they will at least be better than the Trebuchet crew in melee, but they will also perish. In fact, the Trebuchet crew had the general in it as well. Khardlan general somehow managing to avoid death by blackback there. And with the addition of those trollmen on the front line, very quickly what's left of it does crumble. There, Muhad Beast Tamers. Trebuchet crew trying to sandwich the Belagair archers here, maybe try and break them so that the Kindred and the Lorinand archers can start moving forward quickly, but obviously the Trebuchet crew don't have the most powerful charge ever, so it doesn't actually make too much of an impression. Trudging forwards as well, the Beast Tamers. Yeah, I mean, with Trollman, with Blackbacks, and also with supporting Phalanx formation units, surely this is going to be an attack of victory from here. I don't think there's any way back for the defenders, in spite of a fairly domineering performance early on, as it seemed, with the Iron Watch doing heavy lifting, their front lines doing the business. I'm not certain the Trebuchet really paid for itself. We didn't see it do a ton of damage, so it must have used all its ammunition, so maybe that's wrong. The defeat of Gondor and Mordor seems a long time ago now, though, doesn't it? Goblin halberds make their way forwards as well. Blackbacks on their way over here, that's going to cause them to rip through the Trebuchet crew very quickly. In fact, Bard the Bowman admitted defeat there. Khardlan gone. Lothlorien, the only ones that remain, the last defenders left. And that decision to go into the back corner with those Kindred of Celeborn, try and sequester them away, I think that's going to come back to haunt them, honestly. If they were taking more of an active part in the defence and they helped the dwarves more readily over there, I do think they could have outright won against what was left of Umbar and the Misty Mountains over there. Instead, they didn't, they retreated, and I think that was a big, big mistake. I think actually we will go up to ×2 speed here, because it's really just a case of trying to march their way forward. The Lorinand archers' routes, the Kindred of Celeborn are gone. 5% the difference in favour of the attackers. What began with such promise for the defenders as well, in a 5v3, once again goes the way of the attackers. And I have to give credit to the Harad player, actually. Some decisions I wasn't sure about, but in the end, you can't argue with the result. And the Misty Mountain player as well, actually, Evil Casper, given the fact that early on they and Umbar had to really be the sacrificial lambs, I think they did a pretty good job throughout. It's not a glamorous job to slog through an enemy defensive position, but they managed it. And even Gondor and Mordor as well started off quite well, and then for their minor successes they were punished heavily by the defenders, by having the defenders focus on them. But they did important work nonetheless, and so I suppose as you add up all those factors, the attackers are actually very worthy victors of this one. And so there we have it. Just end this battle. There's no need to play the Benny Hill theme as the defenders try to do something. But there we have it. And like I said, for the reasons I just mentioned, I do think the attackers in the end can hold their heads up high as worthy victors in that situation. I think early on they would have been a little bit worried given the kind of damage that the Iron Watch were doing, the Elven archers. You have to ask yourself the question whether or not too much of the ammunition of the defenders was used too early, because late on I think the only thing that we really saw firing was that one unit of battered and bruised Minhiriath archers from Crdolan. Maybe a little bit more was needed, maybe a little bit more restraint in certain areas where they were already winning a battle handily. They didn't really need to go the extra mile of committing more of their ammunition in, but yeah, like I said, Harad and the Misty Mountains also getting the most kills as well as doing a very good job. Umbar less, but again it was difficult for Umbar as well. They were a smaller army that were always going to be more the target for the Elven archers along the choke point they were going through initially. But then everyone I think contributed to this victory. And as for the defenders, what could they have done differently? better projectile management, I think, is one thing. I've already mentioned the Kindred of Celeborn in the back corner of the map. I really don't think that was the play, and it ended up not being so. I don't know what the Trebuchet's fate was. I don't know how many kills it got, but I can only assume it didn't get the maximum amount of kills that you would need in order to make it worthwhile. Didn't see any Dunedain Rangers, which also maybe is, based on the meta of this variant of the game, a little bit of a mistake on Khardlan's part, because Rangers can really make all the difference in the world. But yeah, it is what it is. We'll see what did the damage for Lothlorien. They got the most kills on the map after all, which is not terribly surprising. Khazad Amroth Rangers, honestly, 232 kills on Khazad Amroth Rangers in this situation probably is not enough. I think you need to be getting north of 400 on Rangers in order to have a better chance of winning a 5v3 in this version of the game. Kindred of Celeborn, though, both getting over 400 kills, both with their ranged prowess and, of course, their strength in melee. They were alive until the very later stages of the game also. Lorien archers, many of them. It's kind of hard to read the numbers with the Elven backdrop, I must say. Over 300 kills on the Carascalon's Guardians, used from the beginning, which I do agree with Tommy on that one. I think that was a good move because it forced the Misty Mountains and Umbar into committing more units forward, which in turn led to more kills for the Iron Watch. March Wardens doing decently, Lorien archers as well. A few units not breaking 100, stuff like the Lorien Axemen, that would be disappointing. Swordmass as well, although it was during that period of time where the Snow Trolls were moving forward and the final big push for the attackers on that front line was happening. But yeah, nothing too surprising, maybe a few disappointments, but also a few units performing above their pay grade as well. So yeah, big thank you to Tommy for sending this one in, and a big thank you to all the players as well for being a part of this one. I do have another replay from Tommy as well, which is on the map of Minas Falath, which will probably be coming out in the next week or so, maybe just into the new year. I think the very next video to come out may end up being a channel update, sort of a pre-Christmas one. I will of course be going home for Christmas and I won't be able to take my PC setup with me, but I should have everything good to go in terms of a schedule before I leave, and then come back just as 2023 gets underway. I think that is that's the basic idea here. But yeah, so interesting times ahead. There's going to be, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, definitely a little bit of movement as we move throughout 2023, but for the time being the schedule will remain as it is, and we shall see how things develop in that regard. As time moves forward, of course, everything can always change. I've learned that very much so over the course of the past year. But in the short term, I think the next video will be some sort of channel update, whether it's a live stream if I'm able to do it before I leave, or I have to just pre-record it and let everyone know what the information is, as well as wishing everyone obviously a happy Christmas. And moving forward, got one battle from Tommy the Wise, still got a few from 2 times, a few free-for-alls from the Womb Raider as well. And there is something else. I think I've got some battles from Master Blaster, which I will also be doing in the coming weeks as well. So a decent amount of content. As into the new year as well, I may very well do the knockout tourney between Sword Cavalry. If I start to run low on battle replays, if I record them in bulk and end up running out, I may do that one. But yeah, that's the basic plan. Big thank you to Tommy the Wise once again. Big thanks to all the players. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.